seminal climate bill that included as its centerpiece a federal takeover of renewable energy generation by repurposing the various federal power administrations and creating some new ones. And Johanna, at the Climate and Community Project, seems like you guys have really built upon that and put together a report talking about how to sort of redirect and repurpose existing federal institutions, tribal authorities, and others. Could you just talk a little bit about your report and the work that you've done at the federal level?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Tyson, for that introduction. And thanks to the team that brought this all together. I'm so excited to have discussions about scale and how these things also complement one another. And so, yes, Tyson, as you mentioned, Bernie in one of his, part of his platform was actually this kind of okay, we should actually be building federal public power, which actually, it sounds pretty radical. And also we have done it before, is always an important part of the story here when it comes to, the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority in the United States, Bonneville Power Administration. We actually do have some of this infrastructure that already stands, that the federal government invested in to plug the holes in a lot of ways of where where private institutions or private utilities weren't going. And so we take that kind of concept of what Bernie was talking about and say, okay, well, actually, what does this mean in practice? What does it mean to have a federal public power program, let's say? And that's what we call it in the report. And we say that there are really kind of two main things that we should be doing. One is we should be investing in the publicly owned and cooperatively owned utilities that exist already in the United States, that have experienced massive amounts of austerity, that have experienced, in the shift, the realities of the shift to renewable energy happening in the era of neoliberalism. So much of our renewable energy has actually been developed by private institutions because the incentives have been set up largely for private institutions. And so, this we say is oh, actually, this is a way for us to reclaim some of that space and support the municipal utilities, support the co-ops to actually make that transition. So we say invest in those entities, support them in making the transition to renewables, and also create the sticks, right? Make sure that there are mandates associated with that so that they don't just get the money and run, right? And keep on running the coal plants that they, have had a hard time getting out of. So that's one section, reinvest. The other section is that we propose that we create what we call new regional power authorities. We take a lot of inspiration from the original New Deal, while also understanding that there are real issues to contend with in how the Tennessee Valley Authority has played out, the realities that some of these authorities were a product of their time, and they did not rise above their time, right? Jim Crow is absolutely you can see that part and parcel to how some of the Tennessee Valley Authority was developed. So we say, no, actually, we want these to be 21st century, deeply invested in racial justice, climate justice, environmental and economic justice. And how do we do that? We do that by ensuring that we are, at the same time as building out the actual infrastructure, we're building the social infrastructure as well, the accountability mechanisms, the transparency, the community engagement, and do what I think is not a part of the some of the discussions to date around the Inflation Reduction Act, which has largely left planning to the wayside. That's in part why we say we want these regional planning authorities, or these regional power authorities, to be developing and thinking at that kind of scalar level, that higher scalar level of how is this going to operate at from a regional perspective. And with these regional power authorities, we propose that they do three three things in particular. One is look at how they can support distributed renewable energy and to make that no cost or very low cost to households. Second, we say they should be building utility scale renewables. So hey, who's well positioned to build public renewables on public land? Probably a regional power authority. And third, handle transmission where the private transmission isn't being built, so that we can make sure we have those interconnections. So really, in a lot of ways, what we propose with the regional power authorities is a bit of a displacement strategy. Let's go fill those holes and show how public power could be done at this larger scale. Yes, the two pieces are: one, let's invest in what we have and make it better. And two, let's build and fill the holes where we aren't seeing the investment from the private industry and prove that we can actually do this in a far more accountable and transparent way. The last piece I'll put, and then I'll maybe hand back over to you, Tyson, so we can dig in with Missy and McCall, is a third, we say, this needs to come with the infrastructure, the technical assistance, the work that needs to be done so that people don't feel alone as we're building this out, and it doesn't get captured by private industry through public-private partnerships. We say we need investment in democratic participation, transparency, and technical assistance on how this all should get done. So I think that all of this, and I'm sure we're going to get into it, is complementary and can feed into these things that are happening at the municipal or even more local level along with the federal. So thank you so much.
Johanna, that's great. So Mikhail, Johanna talked a little bit about the New Deal, and FDR, before he became president and presided over the New Deal, he was governor of New York, and his experiences with the complete failure of the corporate utility model initiated the creation of the New York Power Authority. And so can you talk about your role in the city of Pontiac, Michigan, and your efforts dealing with a sort of failed utility in DTE, and your efforts to promote a state power authority similar to what FDR had put together so many decades ago?
Yeah. So quick thing, I will just say my name is pronounced Mikhail because I know most people have probably never heard it said before. And so, I mean, there are a couple of different things. So I think we have to take a further step back and realize that since FDR's time, which, this decision that he made is one that we're kind of leading into where we fully recognize that these investor utilities and these investor goods simply do not put people over profit, right? And unfortunately, that means that something's going to be sacrificed. If you learn about economics, there's the conversation of guns or butter. Well, if an investor utility is going to choose people over profit, something's going to get sacrificed in the process to help the other. But I think a really important thing that we need to discuss is not just reliability, but just redefining what it means to what a public good is. I think that's a huge part of this conversation, because as we're sitting here, we're recognizing that these investor-owned utilities are not meeting the needs of people, which means affordable, reliable energy. And unfortunately, that is partially because we've allowed them to change how we look at people not as citizens. And I don't mean citizens in the exclusionary sense of, you are a United States citizen, but as a person who's a part of a society. We've allowed this shift from citizen to consumer. And we've allowed almost everything that we do to become a thing that is not about, what is for the public good or the welfare of all, but how can we hyper tailor and individualize everything to be exploited and be monetized off of. And so when you look at what's happening, you're seeing these poor Black and Brown communities like the city of Pontiac, like Highland Park, like Detroit, essentially be seen as a really non-competing customer, right? Really one that's held hostage to only one option. And then again, when we have a system that's seen as electricity not being a public good, but a commodity, there's really no way for the communities themselves to compete, despite any one or two individuals being able to afford it. So then you have to make the larger thought process and come to the conclusion that there needs to be something that is a more equalizing factor in all of this, and that is simply not letting profit overtake the needs of people, overtake the needs of the public. Meaning that we need a really any sort of, in my opinion, public people accountable system that is for power, as well as really many other types of public goods. But the reason I like in Pontiac called for the state version opposed to something more local, or like a county consortium, which I've also mentioned before repeatedly. Hopefully that's something that happens before maybe we get to state level public power, is that most of these communities simply don't have the money or resources to be able to opt in. I mean, the city of Pontiac, due to emergency management, thanks to the worst nerd on the planet, Rick Snyder, lost all of our revenue ability. The city of Pontiac has really no revenue minus taxes. We have an operating deficit that we sometimes meet, sometimes don't, of over $3 million. And that's because we have no revenue. We have no water treatment plant. We have a very low tax base. Most of our things are sold off. So we can't purchase DTE's crumbling infrastructure that's over 100 years old, because then purchasing it, we don't have the money or the resources to be able to upgrade it to the standards that we would need. So it's at that point where you have to, as a community, demand that the people who are above you take action. And it's, at least for my intents and purposes, I could yell at the county and tell them to do things. But when there is a perfectly good set of, very progressive House reps who have at one point introduced eminent domaining DT and consumers energy's infrastructure, and whereas many different states in our country have a state-run public power system, we have multiple here in the state of Michigan itself. It's kind of a demand for, fair treatment, to be treated equitably, to be treated like people, because we simply are not in a position because of the state. It's incumbent upon the state to solve it for not just the community that's Pontiac, but other Black and brown communities who got shafted the same way by their policies.
Mikhail, that's fantastic. I am forced almost on a weekly basis to remind regulators at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and elsewhere that the cornerstone of federal law today, Section 201 of the Federal Power Act, exclaims that the delivery and production of electricity is inherently affected with a public interest. And I think we've lost what public interest really is. And I think you're talking about some of these issues in a community like Pontiac that is not being served by a utility like DTE. And I'm glad to hear that there are some representatives in the state of Michigan that are also open to creating a state power authority to address these issues. So Missy, I want to turn it to your role in the city of Ann Arbor, Michigan, where the city council overwhelmingly voted last year to commit significant staff and financial resources to a feasibility study about municipalization options. Can you tell us a little bit about that and some of the collaborations that the city's been doing to further that goal?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. I was thinking about how to frame one of the options, which I don't know if you want me to go here or not, but Jackson had mentioned wanting to talk about a few things. So what I was holding is our community has a pretty audacious and really aggressive goal to be carbon neutral as an entire community in a just and equitable way by 2030. And to achieve that, we know that we have significant work to do in the energy system. The majority of our emissions come from our built environment and how we power and operate that facility. So we know this, and we know we have work to do in that sector broadly. So our motivator has always been 100% renewable energy, right? Like, how do we do that in a just and equitable way? So that's our North Star. Right. And I know we're talking about public power here. So I want to just hold that for a second. And as we were holding 100% renewables, you can look across the landscape and there's different tools that are available to achieve them, but there are different pros and cons in the execution of that. how we're going to get to that goal and objective. So we were having a number of conversations, and our strategy calls for community choice aggregation. And so we are working really hard behind the scenes to get CCA legislation passed in Michigan. And you can imagine that our IOUs see that as a threat to their existence. And so they are fighting really, really hard against CCA. So we're going to continue to push for CCA, but CCAs themselves have undergone an evolution from 1.0, which really is kind of like large scale purchases outside of your community, to what we're seeing today, which is CCA 3.0, which is really investments in the local community itself and the resilience of that local community. And that got us very excited. Simultaneous with this kind of like thinking about CCA and what we would push for and what legislation we're drafting, we had a lot of interest from members of the community in traditional municipalization. And we're sort of holding both of these truths, and we're thinking about, okay, well, what can we do in this landscape? We are different than other communities. And then in that we have what's known as a pre-Foot Act franchise in Michigan. So our franchise isn't negotiable. We have an in perpetuity. Our franchise has been ruled by the courts multiple times to be in perpetuity. So I don't get to go into a franchise discussion and or compete a franchise, right? It's just, yeah, bonkers. I saw your face, Tyson. That is my face frequently when I think about this. So like, it's just a really novel situation to be in, and a pretty shitty one, to be transparent, but that's the landscape that we're in. So we then went to the Michigan Constitution. And the Michigan Constitution is super clear that cities and villages, it is silent on every other unit of local government, but cities and villages have the right to form their own municipal utility, and that utility can compete with the incumbent utility. Now, it has never made sense to have a competing utility, right? Like one side of the street is your IOU, the other side of the street are your poles and wires. You don't have enough base load to be able to handle, like that's just, it's expensive. But then because we were thinking about CCA and local investment, we said, why would we do poles and wires? Why would we not just think about leapfrogging a utility system that's failing us today, which is incredibly vulnerable to climate change, highly centralized, and we know decentralization is essential for more resilient infrastructure. Why would we not spend our dollars investing in a renewably powered microgridded system that has backup power supply for our communities? And what if we did that? Could we do that? And the answer was yes, it's a supplemental utility. And so we brought that into the conversation to say, let's consider all of these things. Let's consider a total municipalization, kind of traditional municipalization. Let's consider a supplemental utility that stacks on top and doesn't have the 24/7 requirement for power provision for multiple years into the future. It allows you to focus really on building the infrastructure we want. Let's think about these other procurement tools that are out there to get to 100% renewable goal. And let's do an analysis of all of them. Let's look across the board at the pros and the cons and identify where they compete and where they do not compete, and where they actually could stack upon each other and build towards future movement. And that's what has been commissioned by City Council, was to look at all of those pathways. We did expect the report last week. It got delayed. Hooray! So we're waiting on the final report to be able to have really detailed community conversations. And it would be the phase 1 report, transparently. The question we asked was how to achieve 100% renewable energy, different procurement options, and different utility structures. We do know that does not focus on investing in increased reliability. That would be a next phase. So this is really just about, from a traditional municipalization standpoint, taking over the existing assets that largely are failing.
Thank you, Missy. So in thinking about all of your perspectives and your presentations, this issue of accountability and governance, it seems to come up. Johanna, you explicitly mentioned it, where you said, you know, we need to learn the lessons of Bonneville Power and TVA, public institutions that are currently not doing work on behalf of the public interest. And some of that is because of governance failings. And so whether we're talking about federal or state or city, what are some mechanisms that we can install to ensure that whatever public systems we put up are going to have equity and racial justice and service and attention to the climate crisis? How do we ensure? Is it in creating a board of directors that's directly accountable to people? Is it having advisory boards that have some authority to weigh in? What kinds of structures have you all thought about to ensure that whatever institutions we create have direct lines of accountability to the people, and particularly communities of color, and ensuring equity? Any thoughts? I'm throwing it out there for anybody.
I'm happy to jump in first, but very interested to hear what Mikhail and Missy have to say as well on this. There are a few things, as you were describing that, Tyson, that came up for me, and things that I've seen. We did this report now probably a year and a half, 2 years ago, that was looking at existing publicly owned utilities and cooperatives to understand, could they be quote unquote anchor institutions for their community? And the answer was like, just very similar to what this report says, like sometimes, yeah, if we did this better, right? If they had more reinforcing infrastructure. And like the truth is, when you talk with people who live in publicly powered spaces or states or cities, right, they often will have some of the same like material realities. Like there is a coal plant in their backyard. They are having like trouble paying those bills. They don't know how to get in contact, but it usually is like the reality is that the person who makes those decisions is just a lot closer than an investor-owned utility, and has to take them more seriously because their fiduciary duty is really to them, not shareholders. So as a framing component here. So, but how do we make these things better is the question that you asked, Tyson. And I think one thing is to add in layers of accountability. The truth is that a board strategy alone is not going to be the be all end all of accountability, transparency, and participation. We need to be thinking like, okay, how do we ground this in people's everyday lives? Are there like neighborhood advisory boards? Are there, equity and justice, like working groups, like these things that actually have teeth that then are grounded in the local level, but then are feeding into these larger systems like a board. So I think it's important for us to think that it's not just one thing that's going to get us that level of transparency and accountability. Boards they are very helpful. And I think that there is a lot of work that's being done on, board reform and transformation, especially in the co-op movement and rural electric co-ops. A lot of the things that I've seen that I'm really excited about are electoral boards as a strategy to create accountability, where, especially if you have a clean election laws that allow people to be able to actually run these campaigns and not have them corporate backed, that allows for so much more of this opportunity to contend for power. And we should be seeing energy, because it is a public good, it is inherently political. And let's talk about that and treat it that way. But in that, I think one thing that Jackson's report and the team's report also shows up is okay, but how do we balance that with technical need? And so I think a combination of electoral plus multi-stakeholder could be a really interesting combination, right? Where you have both people who are environmental justice advocates, industrial players, utility experts that are in conversation with people who've been elected from a local ward, a local neighborhood, right? So that you're having that type of interplay. And then the third thing I wanted to mention that came out in this report we were doing when it came to accountability is thinking about the pipeline for the people who are in the jobs themselves. One thing that people often mentioned is that actually a lot of people who are coming into CEO positions, even at public utilities, are coming from this mentality of corporate infrastructure in America, where they went to an institution, they've got their MBA, they're coming into this role, and their focus is still on the financials and in this frame of not public good, as Mikhail, is it Mikhail? Okay, amazing. I'm so sorry. That as someone who also has a hard name to say, I want to make sure I get it right. But that we need those things like, what does a public service mean, and how do you run something like a utility based on that concept of a public service, not just applying carte blanche, this idea that this runs like a business, because I think that's actually often where we run into some of our accountability and transparency problems as well. So I'll stop there.
Okay, Missy, I don't know if you have any other thoughts or want to jump in.
Yeah, if you don't mind, Missy, if I can go ahead. So I mean, of my own personal opinion, I recognize that there is a strong need for like nuance. In like more localities, I think that the process of having a mixture between like a direct democracy, because I fully believe, like in this having the city of Pontiac been run by emergency management, where we elected people repeatedly and they had literally no power whatsoever to run the city, minus well, really nothing other than maybe a resolution. I think that there's a need to have that control in these systems, especially because uh, we have not had them for so long. But at the same time, there is this conflict with needing expertise, right? So I mean, having someone who like someone who sits on a city council, I think like having like a mixture between like direct electeds and appointments by the governing body would be a nice way to even that out. But personally, I think like at a state level, I think there is, a need to have that uh, non-appointment based mentality, because we see what happens in these rooms where whoever the highest donor is the person who happens to get an appointment, or someone who is able to slide $10,000 to someone's campaign account here or to the family foundation here. And I think it's a really good chance to be able to make sure that the people themselves, have the control. But obviously, there is uh, that trade-off again between having someone run for something versus having the knowledge. It's not always equilateral. There are people who are elected to positions who have no clue what to do with them. There are people who are appointed to positions who have no clue what to do with them. I mean, again, coming from Michigan, we watched Betsy DeVos destroy our education system for 4 years. So I think like it personally should be decided by the people themselves. As a person who is a municipal official, as someone who has been a progressive and socialist organizer and activist, like I fully believe in the need to make sure that the people have influence, and I will typically err on that side of the argument. But I think this like also like largely goes back to our concerns of we're not afraid of the people not making the best decision for themselves. We're worried that there are people who are operating on behalf of influences that are the problem, right? And, the ability to be able to just buy a race and essentially do what everyone has been doing since Reagan, which is just privatizing literally everything, like selling off assets, and like the city of Chicago getting rid of their parking meters, which then costs them billions of dollars in the long run, because the quick short check it turned into a massive shortfall later. That's going to continue to happen until what I think 2083. And so we really have to not look at people themselves being the problem. I guarantee you I could go out right now and find an old Black lady at the Golden Opportunity Club at the Bowen Center right now, who, if I were to put them on a public power board, if the shit was put to her in clear language as to what these decisions mean and not the influences of some rich asshole in a boardroom, they would make decisions that were for the communities themselves. They would make decisions that benefited their neighbors, because people who live in communities care about their communities. I mean, that's why I personally believe that public power is not even a partisan issue, because I guarantee you if I walk my ass to Bloomfield right now and I ask them if they want to keep having their power go off every time there's a storm, I will get a Republican who will be like, no, that's ridiculous. I'm tired of having to pay for this generator. But we've allowed the conversation to go from, really, we've just continued the very anti-government, anti-people sentiment that happened during the Republican heyday of the 80s. Like, we've turned everything into this government bad, business good, individuality great, and losing the idea of like the collective. We keep doing that, and it's unfair to take it a step back to lob that concern onto the people who should be able to govern themselves. And really, it shows us that we need to do a much better job at curtailing and keeping the bad influencers out of our system, and not keep letting them do pay to play their entire way to their dream goals.
Okay, so I'm just going to pop in. I think what was shared is great. I wanted to offer some alternative things in addition to what was kind of offered, that there are ways to hold existing structures accountable and to push on those structures as we're moving towards whatever it is we're moving towards. And so if folks on the line happen to be in Michigan, we expect tomorrow a bill is going to be introduced to expand the authority of the Michigan Public Service Commission to be able to regulate our utilities based on reliability. That's correct. They cannot regulate on reliability today. That is true and ridiculous, but it'll expand their ability to regulate on reliability, climate, equity, and health and energy affordability. So this is a bill, right, that is simply logical, but it needs support. So we can give the Public Service Commission the authority to do that work. So that's coming out. We expect it to have a hearing on Thursday. We right now in our cases, whether that's the IRP, the VGP, the rate case, public comment isn't factored into decision making if it's not part of an official intervener's testimony. How do we get the public stories into this so we can factor it into our decision making in those structures? We need to find a way to do that and tell story. Part of my job in the city of Ann Arbor is intervening in cases and daylighting people's lived experiences so the judge can see that as they're making decisions in that system. So I just wanted to offer that there are things that we need to be doing in our existing system too to make it better, because one of the takeaways I took from the report is not everyone is going to be able to do something like full all out municipalization, especially not day one. So we better be making our existing systems work more effectively too.
Mikhail?
And I want to further hammer on that point, which is, I think, like as Missy pointed out, the fact that the Public Service Commission has next to no power is ridiculous. I mean, the fact that we essentially have an open playground with no one really supervising it. It's almost as if you put the 8th grader outside to watch the 5th graders. Like, that's what's happening. And so, I mean, just to really underline that point, there is no reason why these governmental institutions that, again, should probably be a little bit more democratically decided, that they don't have the teeth necessary to look at the things that are happening in our system. There's no reason why people were without power for almost 2 weeks and the government couldn't say, this is a massive problem and we need to do something immediately, and being able to have the levers and mechanisms to be able to do a thing, opposed to us having to sit here and beg them not to raise our rates. Like that's the furthest that we have power, and that's ridiculous.
Do you mind if I jump on that?
Go ahead.
Just one little piece, because I think that's so key, and I really appreciate this conversation about okay, what do we do within this infrastructure that exists already? How do we make it more accountable to us? And I think one piece that's coming to mind, I was thinking about okay, how did we get this system that we have PUC, public utility commissions, or PSCs, wherever you may be? And part of it actually has to do with public power back in the day, right? Where actually what was happening was that there were all of these public power campaigns that were kicking off in, just after, electricity became so crucial to everyone's everyday lives. Everyone was saying, actually, I think this should be municipal. We should hold on to it. And it was encroaching on investor-owned utilities space, and they were having to compete against this. It was a big problem for them. So Samuel Insull, who was one of the kind of architects of the investor-owned utility, said, y'all, you investor-owned utilities, you know how you don't want regulation, or you don't want this public power to happen. Actually, I think we should consider ourselves, let ourselves be regulated. So in exchange, we get monopoly service. And so then it actually, if you think about it, that was already a compromise that was made to eliminate public power as a way for us to control and operate our energy systems. And I think PUCs have done a massive amount of good. So that's not to discredit them wholly. I think they're important places to contest for power, but I think it is also an important component to realize that this was part of the privatization of our energy system, and to allow for the hegemony of investor-owned utilities. And yes, amazing. I'm so glad that Isaac brought this up.
So Missy said something that made me think about something, just talking about the role. How do you get community engagement? How do you get community on the record in these proceedings? And in 2020, I helped establish the new Office of Public Participation at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is a quasi-independent office within FERC that, among other things, has statutory power to provide intervenor funding, to provide cash payments to community organizations. And so there are some models, and I think that the new director of the FERC Office of Public Participation, Nicole Sitarman, is doing just an incredible job doing outreach and engagement with communities that are directly impacted by utilities, but never were involved in the regulatory process. And I think that's something, when you talk about governance and accountability, there's a growing effort around how to directly engage the public. Another issue that I wanted to throw out there: we're seeing challenges in the sort of for-profit utility model, where you've got needed climate investments, whether it's expensive offshore wind, which are running into some financial headwaters, or you've got issues in California and other states with net metering and rooftop solar, where you've got emerging equity issues. And at the foundations, it's the limitation that utility service is funded through rates. And rates are regressive. They are taking far larger percentages of lower income families' income than wealthier families. And yes, there's a number of different rate designs you can do to try to mitigate that. But at the end of the day, maybe doing a federal or state power authority can tap into non-rate-based financing, into, say, income tax, which is far more, or can be far more, progressive. So are there any thoughts about potential ways to finance the huge amounts of clean energy infrastructure that we need through systems that are not regressive in nature?
I would love to jump in here because I am unofficially, but somewhat officially, part of the Fund My Future revenue table. One of my friends on it. So, I mean, the first things first is, like, one, we need progressive ways of funding things. Ideally, the most immediate one in the state of Michigan is we need a progressive income tax system. There is no reason why there's a flat tax. There are rich people here. I mean, again, if the DeVosses can continue to exist the way that they do, they should be charged for it. But, like, also more importantly, I mean, like, even like the conversation of having income restricted rates. I mean, there's no reason, like, you should be able to pay a portion of your income that is relative to, like, what it should be. No one should be sitting here paying it. I don't even need to really further belabor that point. There are progressive ways of doing this, taxing the rich, taxing large corporations, making large corporations pay higher rates because, again, they're using these things to profit, opposed to the average individual using them to be able to simply, have water running in their apartment or having the lights on to be able to hold a meeting. But I want to keep hitting on, the PIP plans, because they exist in multiple other states, and I think Ohio is one of them. And again, if the state of Ohio, which, being from the state of Michigan, if Lake Inferior can happen to have cool things like PIP plans, there's no reason why the state of Michigan can't. But again, like, if you take a step back, I think beyond just rates and just figuring out how to fund them, which at some point it kind of becomes like an investment as a state, right? Because we need to stop looking at everything as a way to make profit necessarily. Again, with the fact that these things are supposed to be public goods, they are meant to maintain themselves, provide improvements. It's meant to be for the public good of the system. And that means making sure that the system does what it can to does what it can to make sure that, you know, it's being properly funded. And I mean, even like I was at a convention down in St. Louis, and we were discussing housing, and a city councilwoman in DC very much mentioned how, like, yes, to be able to fund affordable housing, we absolutely did raise taxes on the rich. And it's like there is the things that are in the tools that we need to put in place that are progressive. We've done before. We know what they are. We just, again, continue to allow investors to change, rich people to change what is the concept of a public good, for them to change, you know, that we are not a collective society, but that we are a group of individuals. And we are not making these investments in any way other than trying to say, you know, how do we help out the individual? And unfortunately, the individual is whoever's the loudest fucker in the room. So we know what the options are. We know what the tools are. They are there. Just the people who are in power know that they are not the ones that their investors and their friends and their stockholders will.
I want to jump in right after Mikhail, because so many good points. And this gets me so animated. Tyson, I'm so glad this was one of the questions. Because yeah, I definitely believe like tax the rich. We know what to do. We know like this is definitely one of the components that we can use. I also think that this is a question of scale too, right? Where actually in order to handle some of the like racialized inequities of different municipalities and like neighborhoods and so many of these different components, like it actually is important to think about how federal funding could actually support the transition as well, because we are one of like the biggest economic actors in the world. Like the US government can, and not to get into like modern monetary theory or anything, I think that's for another day, but I do think that like the US federal government is in a very strong place in terms of being able to invest in this infrastructure. And when it comes to some of there's often this thought like, oh, well, isn't that going to increase inflation? It's going to run away with us. This is the type of stuff that is productive investment in the economy that is going to create jobs, wealth, benefit, all of these other things. So I actually think like federal investment is really crucial to this, and this federal investment driven into public resources, driven into the public economy will be really crucial. But I just wanted to give two other kind of like examples that come to mind here on a more local level. One is the millionaire tax that was imposed in Portland, Oregon, where the money was then specifically tagged with that millionaire tax to go into climate and also kind of like green infrastructure in the city. And I think you could imagine something very similar, like even if you had a millionaire tax and it helps to subsidize very explicitly, you know, residential energy burden, for instance. Or there's the example, I believe in Seattle, I'm trying to remember if it's Seattle has a publicly owned energy and water system. I'm trying to remember if it's water or energy. They actually have a base pay that is for residential customers, and then if you go beyond that, it's an increased amount that you have to pay. So at least everyone is given like a certain amount of electricity or water for like a certain amount of money. And then the last piece that I wanted to just hark on for a second is the fact that municipalities or states are often using everything within their power to bring private industry into their cities or into their states. So they say, oh, you know, like, oh, that new arms dealer, oh, Boeing, like, let's bring you in. And guess what? We have a publicly owned utility. So we're going to give you like a third, it's going to cost you a third of the price to come in here. But who are the people that actually need lower rates for electricity? It's absolutely residential folks, not industry, who are already getting so many other types of tax incentives. So I'd say like there's also an opportunity, if like we aren't getting to like the full on tax the rich, that we can look at these kind of like strategic angles to start to implement some of that progressive taxation, progressive rate styles and structures on our way to, you know, this being considered a public good and therefore decommodified fully.
Missy, I don't know if you wanted to jump in. Do
Did want
you
to add,
all have any? Oh, please, Mikhail.
and so I wanted to add one other quick thing, and I dropped it in the chat. Like, also another thing that's happening in Michigan is like polluter pay, like making the companies who are doing the most damage to our society paying a fine for their damage. But I think another important thing here is like also we need to look at the effects of making these investments, not just simply the investments and the cost of the system, but the other effects that come from that, right? I think by investing in public power in whichever way that we do it, we're also investing in other parts of our economy, right? Because by having public power, you're bringing back jobs into the public sector. We're able to do just transitions for our energy sector, which is a massive thing to get us off of fossil fuels. But it does a whole lot for social equity because you're bringing jobs back into the public sector, which are more easily unionized. Those wages are higher. You are providing much more oomph back into the working class and the average person by making these investments. So it's not even just like the conversation of power, but we're also bringing in the conversation of obviously the environment, but its effects on socioeconomic class issues, right? So like the idea of spending $1, we're not just spending $1; that dollar travels elsewhere. And I think that's a really important thing to recognize, and especially how much power that has when solving, again, like really socioeconomic issues in a lot of these communities. Because at that point, you're now hiring union labor or labor that's being paid with real wages and benefits, opposed to having someone work 1,001 hours to maybe possibly be able to afford a medical bill.
Were there any other issues that haven't been raised yet that you wanted to add? If not, we can. I don't know if we can do a general Q&A session. We've got a lot of folks. So Jackson, I don't know what next steps on potential Q&A could be.
We absolutely can do a general Q&A session. I was going to pop in to say that just at this moment with 10 minutes left. So I will say we're going to keep participants on the video and audio off for now. But stick your hand up if you want to ask a question verbally. If I would also just say the chat is going to be the easiest thing. So if folks want to drop a question in the chat, I would welcome some questions from the audience. While that offer is out there, I welcome panelists to just keep talking because this has been very fun to listen to.
Well, I'll add something. I see Craig Rose put in a question in the chat. And first, I just want to give a shout out. When I first started chasing Enron around during the California electricity crisis, Craig Rose was the utility reporter for the San Diego Union Tribune and did terrific reporting. And you just don't see, newspapers now have dedicated journalists to just cover utility issues, like when I started doing this over 2 decades ago. So Craig asked a good question in the conversation about potential shifts in revenue bases away from electric rates and into more progressive things like taxes. How are you not encouraging irresponsible consumption? And I think you don't break away entirely from electric rates. It's about additive financing. We saw that with the Inflation Reduction Act, right, which is committing billions of dollars for a whole new generation of renewable electricity production, but it's all in corporate hands. And in fact, for the most part, only corporations can take advantage of those taxes. So we've got massive federal outlays for the creation of both transmission and electricity production completely outside of public power. There are opportunities in IRA and the infrastructure bill for municipal utilities to participate, but not nearly at the scale. And so we're just talking about the federal government is already making huge financial commitments to new infrastructure development, but it's just all for-profit corporate. So I don't know if others have anything else to say or add.
I saw Missy raise her hand, and I've got something after that, unless you want to.
It wasn't about this. It was about Jackson's, like, any closing thoughts. So go for it, Johanna.
Oh, okay, great. I just wanted to, I think that Craig, that's just a really fantastic question in terms of like, there is a nervousness and rightfully so. I think like, if you look to the big mansions of California, like watering their lawns, like that's not the world we're trying to build. We're trying to build something that's like far better than that, where we have equity across them. And I think that like anything that we do has to go alongside, like the fight for energy justice is also like a fight for housing justice. And so I think, it's really crucial for us to think about how we're investing in those houses, because energy burden is often so associated with like the reality that you have like some of the worst housing stock that, low income renters have to live their lives in, where, they actually might actually be using a lot of the energy and electricity, but that's not their like fault. That is like a fault of the infrastructure and system that we have. So I think, one component is like, let's do very aggressive energy efficiency investments that both are investments as well as requirements and regulations for the people who can pay themselves, right? So I'd say that's one component to it. And then the other is, I think like if you have that energy efficiency infrastructure in place, you're deploying it, you're making sure that people have comfortable homes, then I think you can say like, okay, you can, for instance, we are living in a decommodified world that we're all building. You would say like a certain amount of your electricity, it's yours. You deserve this, is a public good. But if you go beyond like X amount, that's when like we are seeing this as like a luxury item as compared to like the realities of just surviving and operating it, and also enjoying life. I think that everyone also deserves to like not just live on base necessities, like we deserve more than that. But I think it is like, it's going to be a complicated thing that will take more time to discern, especially as we're experiencing the realities of like extreme heat days where people are going to be using more energy at like different times when like the grid is going to be struggling. So when we're talking about this, like how do we do this and make sure that it's not incentivizing the wrong things? I think it is a good question to be asking. And I think it's on us to figure out like what's the systemic answer to that, and what a crew of people that have been on the past couple of days to think about and design and strategize around that.
Missy, did you want to add something?
It was different. It was sort of a
Okay.
thought that I hold a lot in the ecosystem, which is I am very thankful for the electric system we have, right? It is the largest operating machine that we've got on the planet, and it has helped many, many things happen and afforded me an incredible quality of life. That said, it is not the electric system that's going to bring us into the future. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about the fact that big centralized systems are really vulnerable systems, that we are in a climate crisis, a housing crisis, an equity crisis, and that what got us into that is not what's going to get us out of it. And so I just challenge us all to really think about both the ownership structure, which I know is what most people really deeply care about, and also what is it we're creating? Because I don't think it's what we have. At least for me, deeply, deeply motivated by the climate crisis, I don't see how the existing structure works.
I think that we're at 4:57, and as much as I want to take more questions, I think that I am gonna say let's get closing thoughts from Johanna and Mikhail, and then I will close us out for the day.
I can very quickly jump in and say, if you want to be more involved and you have a public power campaign, you're thinking about a public power campaign as a crew, Jackson has mentioned this in the past. We are scheming in Maine, where there is actually a public power campaign on the ballot in November. I'm also from Maine, so I'm just really excited people get to come to my hometown and fight for my public power. But if you are interested in that, we are going to be doing like a 2 to 3 day strategy session. And I know there are folks on the call here who have been instrumental to organizing that. And I'm going to throw the form in. It's open for a couple more days.
Mikhail, last word?
Yeah. I really just want to deeply highlight one, that this is what we're watching is something that's been decades in the making, and it's going to take a lot of work for us to get out of it. I think the solution for everything is going to be extremely intersectional across so many different issues. I mean, even in like my recent resolution for housing for the city of Pontiac included the fact that people are cost burdened by not only housing but utilities and food. But also in the state of Michigan, there is a amazing public power campaign happening with A2P2. So I'm going to definitely highlight them, as I am on their advisory board. But more importantly, highlight the importance that in the very near future, the state of Michigan could be having its own public power campaign. So if you are here, definitely pay attention, because the momentum is moving. The arc of justice is hopefully bending back to our side, as long as we maintain and keep our weight on it. So I encourage all of you to stay involved, especially if you're here in Michigan or elsewhere.
Tyson, as moderator, any like final just reflections on hearing all these brilliant people talk?
Let's do it. I'm motivated. Thanks for having me be a part of it.
Amazing. Huge thank you to our panelists. I'm mad that we only have an hour because I've talked. Yeah, there's a lot to say. But I really appreciate the way this panel deeply opened up the diversity of tactics that are needed, both within the scope of advancing public power and in the intersecting with how do we ensure the best possible outcomes for people stuck with their incumbent utilities, while we're stuck with them, right? And how do we consider all these complex elements of the energy transition right now? So I think with that, Liz, I think we can cut recording on this panel. Say thank you all very much.